I'm Glenn Campbell with an introduction to demographic doom, which is my label for the perfect storm of demographic crises that are bearing down on humanity even as we speak. You thought climate change was a big problem for humanity? Demography may be even worse. What is demography? It's just the counting of people and sorting them into categories and using that data to predict the future. It turns out there are some aspects of the future we can predict very well, and what demography is telling us is that we're heading to a great collapse. Not just a population collapse, but an economic collapse. Demographic doom isn't simple. There are a lot of things going on simultaneously. We're having too many babies in some parts of the world and not enough babies in other parts of the world. And the way our talent is distributed is profoundly dysfunctional. Demographic doom is a problem with the logistics system by which humanity creates new human beings, trains them, and distributes them around the globe. Demography interacts with economics in many ways, both simple and complicated. It's a simple fact that if your society isn't growing, its economy can't grow. And if your society is shrinking in numbers, your economy is eventually going to shrink. But there are also effects when a growing population turns into a shrinking population. There you have transitional issues, which is what we're in the middle of right now. Right now we're facing a huge economic crash, maybe bigger than anything we've seen before, because our population has shifted its trajectory from high growth to low growth. What it means is that we have committed ourselves in many ways to high growth, yet so when low growth comes along, there are going to be problems, there are going to be collapses. For example, if a government has spent more money than it's taking in and has taken on a certain amount of debt, assuming that their population and their tax base is going to continue to grow, then there's going to be a disaster when the tax base and population doesn't grow. The government, one way or another, is going to have to default. Demography sounds like the dullest topic in the world, and it's hard to get people to take it seriously, which is why I've got to explain it to you. I want to run through the logic that leads me to conclude that we're in deep trouble. Demographic doom isn't just one problem, but many. So let me try to step through some of them for you in a logical progression, from the simplest problem to the more complex. Hopefully by the end of this video, you will have a grasp of what's going on and will be as concerned as I am about the future of humanity. You've heard of the population explosion, the claim that the human population is growing exponentially. It will soon outstrip our resources and lead to mass starvation. This was a theory popularized in the late 1960s and early 1970s, chiefly by a book called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. Come on out. Come on around. It turns out that in the 60s and 70s, the population explosion was already being addressed because the tide had turned and people were no longer having as many babies as they used to. You can still argue that the world is overpopulated, but you can't argue that the population is exploding anymore. There are almost 8 billion people in the world right now. Eventually that number will probably rise to 9 billion. But it's not going to get much higher than that because throughout most of the world, fertility is falling. Fertility is the number of babies that each woman on average has in a given society. So you need a fertility rate of 2.1 to refresh your society, maintain your society. In most countries of the world, fertility is under that. In Europe, as a whole, fertility is down around 1.5 babies per woman. So there's no longer any explosion except in the poorer areas of Africa. Places where people are so poor that they don't have access to basic services like birth control. In the rest of the world, there's no risk of a population explosion. There's more a risk of a population implosion. Japan is currently imploding. Its population is falling by almost 500,000 every year. And many countries of Eastern Europe are in the same boat. Why aren't people having children these days? A better question is, why would they want them? There's no great incentive to have children, and there is enormous cost and enormous risk involved. Evolution has given humans some powerful drives to encourage reproduction. Most notably, our sex drive, our desire to mate with a member of the opposite sex, that obviously has a reproductive purpose. And we've short-circuited that with something called birth control. Now you can have sex, now you can bond with a partner and have sex with them without the risk of having babies. Another powerful drive is the desire to take care of small creatures. Everyone wants to care for babies. Everyone loves to talk to babies and interact with babies and make them smile. So how have we thwarted that? Well, we've invented something called pets, where people adopt children that are non-human, and they devote all their parental attention to these pseudo-children instead of real children. Hello. At a certain stage in human history, children had an economic function. If you lived on a farm, your children were your farm hands. You put them to work almost as soon as they could walk. So it's beneficial to a farmer to have a lot of children. Come on down.
Hello. We've gone now, mate, so you'll have some peace and quiet.
Oh, that's all right.
What are you tuning for, anyway?
It's just a talking video about something totally unrelated, about demography.
Oh, right.
It's just a nice setting.
All right, lovely. Well, good luck.
Thanks. Children also provided a sort of retirement plan, so that when you got old and frail and infirm, you knew that your children would take care of you. Neither of those things really apply anymore. We're not allowed to work children in the fields anymore, and children aren't expected to take care of their parents when they get old. The parents are expected to have their own pension plans, and children are just expected to visit. So what it boils down to is there is no incentive for people to have children anymore, so they're not. There are only two reasons to have children today. One is emotional fulfillment. People feel that they need these creatures in their lives, much like they feel they need pets. So they have them to fulfill some sort of need inside them. The trouble is, this need is very quickly fulfilled. After one or two children, you feel very emotionally fulfilled. You feel no need to have any more children, which isn't really sufficient to solve humanity's population problem, because if one couple has two children and two couples have no children at all, we're still not refreshing the population. The only other reason to have children is that birth control fails, or they don't use birth control, or don't have access to it, or they get raped. That's basically the situation in the poorer countries of Africa. They have a population explosion there simply because they don't have enough access to birth control. The bottom line for everyone else is that having children just doesn't make economic sense. And there's no incentive that a government can provide to overcome that economic disincentive. Children are so incredibly expensive that having the government give you a few $1,000s isn't going to change the calculus any. Hello, come on in.
Oh, thank you.
My office.
We're just creeping through here.
So the basic, the simple threat is that your community, your country will simply cease to exist over a period of time. That's only the simple crisis. Yes, Japan is vanishing, but it's doing it slowly. The more immediate concerns involve economics and the impact that population has had on how our economies function. Although demographic change happens slowly, there are certain economic effects that can happen very rapidly. Mostly these concern the transition from a high birth rate to a low birth rate, which is exactly what happened in America and many other countries in the middle of the 20th century. Immediately after World War II, America and some other countries had a baby boom, where all of a sudden people had a lot of babies. Between 1946 and 1964, everyone was having babies, and the average fertility rate was almost 4 children per woman in the United States, and even higher in some other countries. What this baby boom created was a sort of economic stimulus. So after these children were born after World War II, they moved on up. They became adults and they started powering the economy. They needed, all of these children eventually needed homes. So new homes were built all over America. And they needed appliances for the homes. So washing machines and refrigerators were built, and they needed cars. So this baby boom was a huge economic stimulus for the United States. The only trouble is what happens when that stimulus ends. So just after the baby boom, births took a drop because we discovered birth control and women became liberated to work in the workforce. And suddenly they weren't having many babies anymore. The fertility rate dropped to just about replacement level, just about 2.1 babies per woman. Now that would be a good thing, except that the baby boom generation is creating false expectations that cannot possibly be fulfilled. Let me try to make this a more concrete. Let's imagine a car company makes cars, sells them to people. And during the post-baby boom, which would be from the late 1960s to the end of the century, they were selling a lot of cars because there were a lot of new drivers, and everyone was buying cars left and right, which was great for Ford and General Motors and all those other car companies. Then what happened is the baby boomers started retiring, and the car companies are losing customers. So Ford and General Motors can't possibly do as well now in the 21st century as they did in the 20th century because they just don't have enough customers. The demography isn't there to produce the customers they need to buy the cars. The trouble is, investors looked at Ford and General Motors and they saw their sales going up every year in the last quarter of the 20th century, and everyone figured, well, if a company is growing, it's going to keep growing, and that was priced into their stock, this idea of perpetual growth, which means when people finally realize that there aren't going to be enough customers for these cars, the stock has to tank at some point. And that analogy applies to our entire economy. Our whole economy is addicted to growth. And if you take the growth away, suddenly things start collapsing. Assets start falling in value. And we just can't maintain this bubble anymore. So the baby boomers created a bubble, and as they retire, as they move out of the workforce and move out of the consumer force, the bubble is going to pop. And my prediction is that this crash could happen just about now. It's already overdue. The fact is, we don't have enough customers. The economy doesn't have enough customers to support itself at the same level as it did before. Moreover, we've got a lot more old people and a lot fewer young people. That's the natural effect of not having babies. It means that you have a lot of elderly people just retiring, and you have very few young workers coming online to replace them. And there aren't enough young workers now paying taxes to support the old workers who are retiring and who are expecting these pensions and these benefits that the government has promised them. So all that's coming together in a perfect storm, a perfect economic storm of things collapsing all at once. There being too many people retiring, not enough workers, and assets falling because investors finally realize that a company can't keep growing when the customer base is shrinking. This is especially devastating when you look at government debt. The government in the United States has been borrowing money hand over fist, and the deficits rise every year, and the total debt load rises every year, and there's no way to bring it down. At the same time, the number of people paying taxes is leveling off, and eventually it will fall. So just like General Motors doesn't have enough customers, the US government doesn't have enough taxpayers to pay its huge debt. So eventually the government has to default on that debt. And that's just one of the dominoes that's going to fall all at once when this process actually begins. Now, I can't tell you when the process is going to begin. I would have thought it would happen several years ago. But we're building up these multiple bubbles in our economy, and eventually they're all going to crash, and then we are not going to recover. Unlike most recessions, this recession is just going to go on and on and on because we're just not generating enough customers, enough taxpayers, and things have to fall apart. What happens when the government defaults on its debt? Well, then it has a lot of trouble borrowing money again, so it cannot provide the services that it used to be able to provide. The U.S. government, for example, is spending in its budget about $4 trillion a year. It is taking in taxes only about $3 trillion a year. The other trillion is being borrowed. So can you imagine what would happen if a consumer did that? Imagine that you were spending $40,000 a year but only making $30,000 a year. That's $10,000 added to your debt every year, and as long as you're in the hole, there's no way you're ever going to pay that debt back. Well, the government isn't any different. Yes, it's paying a lower interest rate, and yes, it can print money on demand, but the fundamental laws of gravity still apply. A government or any entity can't keep spending money beyond its means forever. Sooner or later, something has to break. So when that something breaks, there's going to be this huge economic disaster, equivalent, I would guess, to the Great Depression, something that is absolutely devastating and goes on for a very long time. And when that sort of event happens, people stop having babies. So even if our fertility is below replacement now, it's going to get even worse during this big economic collapse. So one way or another, the world will dig itself out of this economic collapse, but we may lose governments. We may lose a banking system. Lots of things will fail, and basically we'll have to reconstruct our economy from scratch. So that's the short-term demographic crisis. It's an economic crisis that was driven by this baby boom bubble that has to pop sooner or later. But wait, that's just the beginning of our demographic doom, because if we look at things on a longer time frame, like 50 years, things are going to get even worse. Not only do we need to worry about the quantity of our population, but also the quality of our population. In the long run, after the economic collapse, the problem for humanity is going to be the quality of the people it is producing. It's a very touchy subject because we don't like to think of people in quality terms. That's often equated with racism. But I'm not talking about race here. I'm talking about individuals and what they are capable of. Children tend to emulate their parents, tend to reproduce the value systems and the belief systems and the abilities of their parents. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's statistically, children turn out like their parents do. This is a problem in demography because by and large, the most successful people in society are not having babies. This is true no matter how you measure success. If you measure it in terms of income, well, people with higher income have fewer babies than people with lower income. Or you measure it by education, people with more education have fewer babies than people with less education. Now, you can see where this is headed, that most of the heavy work of making babies is falling to the less advantaged members of society. This is true in any society. It's the less educated. It is the less financially sound people who have more babies. And over time, over generations, this has to be changing the makeup of society. This is especially a concern in a democracy where everyone has an equal vote. So intelligent people don't have a more powerful vote than less intelligent people. So if less intelligent people are generating all the babies, this has to affect the quality of the electorate and whether they make good decisions. This kind of has come up with the election of Donald Trump and other populist leaders, and you wonder, how can these voters be so stupid? And maybe in some way it is because people of lesser ability are having more children. Government incentive programs have a perverse effect of encouraging the least capable members of society to have more children. For example, a government may offer a cash bonus to parents who have more than one kid. But what kind of parents is this encouraging? Are they having children for love, or are they having children for money? And anyone with half a brain is going to realize that whatever bonus the government offers pales in comparison to the costs and risks of having children. So the well-to-do and the more intelligent are still going to stay away. But some people might be tempted by that cash bonus, and it's not the right kind of people. There's a real risk of an idiocracy where 100 years from now the general population isn't as intelligent as it is today. There's no direct evidence for that happening, but it's kind of unavoidable. If the less successful members of society have more babies, then over time their offspring are going to rule the world. And you don't have to decide whether it's nature or nurture that produces a child. If both of them are defective, then a child is going to be a less well-equipped citizen. So I don't have a solution to this, at least within current social structures. The nuclear family as we know it just isn't doing the job. It isn't producing enough babies, and the quality of the babies is kind of so-so. The quality of the children produced by the nuclear family, you've got some great families, you've got some pretty lousy, traumatic families. And over time it seems to be the defective families that are going to be winning because they produce more babies. Another factor in population quality is migration. People moving from one country or community to another. In the developed world, immigration is seen as a good thing. You bring in a worker from another country into your country, you're gaining the benefits of that worker who's going to pay taxes without having to lay out any money to raise and educate that worker. So it's great. Immigration is great from the standpoint of the receiving country. It's horrible from the standpoint of the donor country, who is losing its human capital. This is happening in Eastern Europe. The most talented young people in Eastern Europe are coming to Western Europe, which is great for Western Europe. But it's horrible for the countries they leave behind, which are losing their most precious resource. So demographic doom to me means several things. First, there's an economic collapse, which could happen any day now. which is the result of moving from high births to low births. Then there's the problem of countries that are just shriveling away because they don't have enough babies, like Japan and Eastern Europe. And at the same time they're not having any babies, everybody is getting old and retiring and becoming a drain to the government without any new workers to support them. Then you have the problem of population quality, that the wrong people are having a lot of babies and the right people are not having many at all. And all of this adds up to a lot of chaos for a long time until humanity figures out what to do. I don't honestly believe that humanity is going to expire. Sooner or later, somebody will figure out how to have more babies. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of instability, economic instability, social instability. There could be a lot of economic upheaval where populist leaders promise to solve problems that they can't. I think we're looking at a sort of dark age coming down upon us. I don't know how long it's going to last, but there has to be this period of pain, because only with this period of pain are some people going to take the initiative to come up with something new. The nuclear family that we know, which is 2 parents and a couple of kids, just isn't doing the job. It isn't producing enough children, and it isn't producing the right kind of children. So we have to come up with some kind of new family structure. And I talk about that in other videos. In this video, I just want to emphasize how bad things are. We're in for a huge economic crash and a population collapse that none of us is prepared for. In a few years, we're going to be overwhelmed with old people and have very few young people. And that's a horrible situation to be in, because when people get old, they get sick and infirm, and there will be nobody to take care of them, nobody to fund their pensions. So you're going to have a lot of homeless old people. It's not a pretty sight. I can't see any short-term optimism here. I can only look into the far future, 50 years from now, and look for long-term optimism when people figure out some sort of new structures that makes humanity sustainable again. This is Clovelly. Clovelly, Devon. Clovelly, England, a seaport town on the west coast of England. All right, turn this off. All right, turn off the GoPro.